We're watching them actually solve these problems, novel sort of from scratch evolution, and often in ways that would have been impossible to predict before we started our experiment, and in ways that sort of leverage, bootstrap things that are relatively easy to get, where physics kind of creates traits that we normally sort of use a lot of biological mechanism to create. Physics does a lot of the work for you in the beginning. It can kind of act as a scaffold to make things happen, and then biological innovations act as refinements. We know the conditions under which alignment is stable, in which it arises, in which it's stable. We know the conditions where alignment falls apart and things deteriorate. Ideas can spread from brain to brain, and it's super interesting to think how coupling real-world resources to the behavior of agents and creating mechanisms for those agents to modify their traits in a way that's heritable could actually result in the open-ended evolution of... My name is Will Ratcliff, and I'm actually now a full professor at Georgia Tech.
Oh, congratulations! Sorry.
Thank you. I need to update my website. Yeah,
That's right.
And I'm also the director of our interdisciplinary graduate program in Quantitative Biosciences. And my own research is I'm interested in understanding the origin of complex life. I'm an evolutionary biologist by training, and actually my training was in symbiosis, understanding how cooperation and conflict, I don't know why I pronounce the COs the same, cooperation and conflict play out in ways that can both result in the rapid deterioration of cooperative behaviors or can result in what's effectively the long-term stability of cooperative interactions, which you can reframe as an alignment problem. My own research is really at the interface of evolutionary biology and biophysics, because my main collaborator is a physicist. And I think that's an area that you can't actually understand the origin of, in my case, multicellular organisms. Organisms that contain more than one cell, like plants, animals, mushroom-forming fungi, and seaweeds. And there's others too, but those are the really fancy ones. Those evolved from single-celled ancestors. And it sort of opened the ceiling for the sort of types of complex life that could exist. And in the absence of multicellular life, you're limited to things that are at the scale of a protozoan or an amoeba, not as complex as a plant or an animal. But it's a hard transition to study because these transitions occurred in the deep, deep past, hundreds of millions of years ago, in some cases billions of years ago. And we don't really have much information, especially about dynamical processes in evolution, for those first steps. So in our laboratory, we do something that's pretty unique. We are evolving novel multicellular organisms over 10,000 plus generation timescales in the laboratory. Our system is called snowflake yeast. They're based on brewer's yeast. And we started with a single-celled yeast, and we quickly sort of got these things which have rudimentary groups that are just dumb clumps of cells. And now, after a little over 9,000 generations and counting, we're watching them solve all these fundamental problems of sort of multicellular complexity, getting a multicellular life cycle that allows multicellular traits to be heritable, circumventing materials toughness problems. How do you build a big, strong body? Circumventing diffusion problems. Once you have a big, strong body, all the cells on the inside are starving. How do you get them resources? Circumventing developmental problems. You start out with one cell type, but multiple cell types lets you begin to build organisms that have new morphologies. And we're watching them actually solve these problems with novel sort of from scratch evolution, and often in ways that would have been impossible to predict before we started our experiment, and in ways that sort of leverage, bootstrap things that are relatively easy to get, where physics kind of creates traits that we normally sort of use a lot of biological mechanism to create. Physics does a lot of the work for you in the beginning. It can kind of act as a scaffold to make things happen, and then biological innovations act as refinements. So anyway, that's kind of what we do, is we're watching multicellular life arise from scratch and then pulling that all apart and figuring out how they're doing it and what the principles are.
So you're being able to abstract sort of different mechanisms that come into being at different kinds of phases of development and evolution, and what they're selected for and selected against. I mean, to put this in a simpler and sort of more conventional mode that I'm familiar with. I mean, I remember looking at. You would have the notion of the selfish gene. You had sort of Dawkins talking about the selfish gene, and then you had Hamilton talking. It was always done work, about altruism, and then you had Friedrich talking about altruistic reciprocity.
Yep.
Then you had this discussion about with Wilson and Martin Novak and other people talking multi-level selection. And
Hmm.
all of that was very contentious in the whole biological field, and this whole contest
It
between
was.
sort of selfish and cooperators, and even the idea of talking about agentic systems was
Hmm.
in my generation was taboo. Um, and
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah.
you it was suicide. I mean, if you did anything
Hmm.
about that, I mean, my interest originally is to be a PhD and did PhD at the AI lab at MIT. That's where I did
Hmm.
my work. But
Hmm.
I was interested in cybernetics, and cybernetics was considered to be marginal.
Hmm.
Though you could prove it, you could build a system,
Hmm.
it just was not part of the general narrative. Now it's being more incorporated, but there was a strong resistance to that. But what I guess the question I'm trying to set up here um, is this notion of when you build, you can look at games, you can have cheaters and cooperators, defectors.
Hmm.
I was reading one of your papers in which
Hmm.
one of your it wasn't your paper, it's one of the papers you gave me a list for,
Yeah.
and the idea of when you have cheating, when you have
Hmm.
altruism, when these things
Hmm.
work, when they don't work. You also did a
Hmm.
paper, I think, looking at the commons, the concept of the
Hmm.
treasure of the commons. I've been very
Hmm.
interested in that with
Hmm.
Eleanor Ostrom's work on the
Hmm.
governing the commons.
Yeah.
And so part of the thing we're interested in doing is building sentient agents, and this is in conjunction with the Active
Hmm.
Inference Institute. And so
Hmm.
what are the principles of sort of when you take multiple agents and you kind of them come together and create
Yes.
higher levels of complexity,
Yes.
multi-scale competencies in which they
Yes.
maintain their own individual interest, fitness, but they have a larger fitness
Hmm.
function that encompasses them. And then how can you make that resistant to
Hmm.
defectors, cheaters?
Yeah.
I mean, because this comes into a broader social context. I mean,
Hmm.
I think we're
Hmm.
right in the midst of these issues right now,
True.
and so I'm so fascinated to say, okay, is
Yeah.
there a scientific principle basis by which we can
Yes.
understand these things? And when
Yes.
alignment takes place and when it doesn't take place, what are the conditions? What are the
Yes.
trigger points? So, okay,
Yes.
I-
There
is
is.
that
There is. I think this
yeah?
is largely a solved problem in evolutionary biology. There's still stuff we can work on, but the big picture is clear. We know the conditions under which alignment is stable, in which it arises, in which it's stable. We know the conditions where alignment falls apart and things deteriorate. And this is a fairly big discussion. So let's like make this a discussion and not just a monologue here. But I want to start by pointing out that there are two very different principles at play when we are talking about the evolution of cooperation and the evolution of new kinds of individuality. And by individuality, what I really mean is the primary level at which an organism is gaining adaptations. So, like, if we look at humans, we are individuals, we are organisms, and we have human level adaptations. My height, my ability to run quickly, my ability to throw a baseball, like, those are traits of the group. And in many of these major transitions in evolution, in which we're talking like the origin of the first cells, the origin of eukaryotic cells, which are like fancy cells with complex architecture, which actually result from a symbiosis of two completely different species of bacteria like organisms, archaea and bacteria. The origin of multicellular organisms, and then in some cases, the origin of sort of what we might call a superorganism, which is a colony of multicellular organisms that kind of becomes the individual. Like in each case, you have something where you have a sort of shift in the level of selection, a shift in the level of organization, and the shift in the level of what you would call the individual.
There's a lot there.
Yes.
Yeah, and
And that's just the appetizer.
I know.
Yeah.
So what is, I mean, and I had
Yeah.
this conversation with Michael as well. I mean, this is the observer and what is exists in the cell, what outside the cell. I mean,
Hmm.
it's like he would argue that there's this bioelectrical field that actually is the memory that in the analogy that was used as the Theseus ship is all
Hmm.
new parts and
Hmm.
how they're assembled. It does not
Yeah.
resemble, it's not in the ship itself, but it's in a field behind the ship.
Hmm.
So this is some kind of emergent cognition. I mean, and so what I'm trying to get at is if one's designing something, rather than focus on the thing,
Yes.
it's behind the thing in some sense. And when you talk about an individual,
Yes.
and this is you're creating new kinds of selves, new kinds of
Yes.
identities,
Yep.
embodied in a larger identity. There's
Yes.
part of, and they each have their own
Mm-hmm.
set of intentions. I would this if they use they're agentic in their own sense, right? I mean, so they have
Mm-hmm.
certain. So um, how does that
So yeah,
work?
I can
Yeah,
explain this. Yeah,
yeah,
this is great. This
yeah.
is basically what I do my research on. So I can definitely explain this part. One thing to note is that the origin of new levels of biological individuality doesn't mean that you completely lose the former levels. So the organisms that you see today are kind of these Russian nesting dolls of evolutionary individuals. If you think of, just take yourself, right? You have sort of the human level individual, which is a biological level of organization which undergoes Darwinian evolution because it satisfies the criteria for adaptation through natural selection. That is, we reproduce, we have mutations arise that create heritable variation in traits at the level of this human level individual. Selection acts upon those traits, right? Beneficial variants increase in frequency and deleterious ones decrease in frequency. And as a result, you gain adaptations at that level. But we still have, we're still made of cells. We're made of almost 40 trillion cells. And before multicellularity evolved in animals, sorry, my dogs are barking. Before multicellularity evolved in animals, the cell was the primary level of individuality. Cells reproduced, they had heritable variation, cell level traits, those affect fitness, and cells gained adaptations and got more fit, right? And if you're thinking of eukaryotes, before eukaryotes evolved, the same was true for what became our mitochondria, which is a free-living alpha proteobacterial bacteria, and what was probably the sort of primary composition of the host cell, which is an archaean, a completely different lineage, a very, very deep branching lineage of bacteria-like organisms. And each of these levels, as you go up a level, you tend to de-Darwinize those lower levels. The lower levels are kind of stripped of their individuality, but it's not completely gone. And part of what makes this such an interesting field is that making a new level and making it stable actually relies on a large degree in how good evolution is at suppressing lower level individuality. So I'll give you a great, easy to understand example, right? You have hundreds of cell types in your body, right? Your skin cells basically dedicate their lives to, helping protect you from the outside world, right? And they are not on the line of descent. And they're like, your skin cells are just reproducing as skin cells and they'll never make another human. If you scrape them off your body, they're just dead. They don't land on the ground, they become little amoebae and eventually fuse back into like micro johns, which can help you write your next grant proposal. Like they're just done, right? And that's a derived state, right? That switch from being sort of something which was capable of reproduction to losing that capacity, that's a derived state. And it works because they share the same genes as those in your reproductive cells. So if they can do something which helps the group do better and allows you to have more kids, they are propagating their own genetic interests.
Can I?
Please.
So this
Yeah.
is really because we're working on building systems that work on that same nested principles and so
Yes.
AI agents,
Mm-hmm.
and so the paradigm that we're working in is I don't know if you're familiar with Carl Friston's work and free energy principle and free energy minimization, but he's done a
Not very
lot.
well.
He's a so he is and so what we're looking at is you have these different agents and they're coming in that they have they call it they say expected free energy minimization in the sense that they're doing something to preserve themselves, but they do have a sense of a larger group in which
Mm-hmm.
they will communicate around to
Mm-hmm.
reduce uncertainty at the larger context. So it's not just an
Mm-hmm.
optimization themselves, but they're actually they can discover it. And this is I think similar to what Michael Levin talks about when he talks about a cognitive light cone. It's so
Mm-hmm.
there's something that spans and is so does that what I'm saying translate into what you're saying, or you're translating what I'm saying? Because I'm trying to say a couple.
Perhaps.
Yeah, we're trying
Maybe
to
one way to
design
restate it.
actually do this right. Yeah.
Yeah, one way to restate it is that evolution works on lineages over generations, right? And so altruism is not a problem at all as long as the benefits of altruism are primarily going towards members of the lineage that express those altruistic traits. And
Okay.
so,
Can I just a
yeah,
second?
please, yeah.
Because so you have the whole idea of altruism basically
Hmm.
saying it's with kin, related kin, and that would be the one argument, right? Just saying that
It's
you know,
one mechanism. It's not the only mechanism, but it's
that's
definitely a
what I'm
very
saying.
good one.
So,
Yep.
but that has been the strong argument. Say, well, it's only with kin
Yes.
related, and therefore you don't have. Then you have someone like Novak, and will also say, well,
Yep.
no, actually, you can have it with unrelated kin. And I think one of the
Yeah.
articles that you're talking that you gave me was they talked about relatedness,
Hmm.
and in a sense, it doesn't necessarily have to follow in a in a lineage. I mean, well, I mean, in a
That's right.
so that well, that's see that all these things
Yeah.
become big issues when these
Yes.
become political issues, economic issues
Mm.
when they
Mm.
translate. These these
Yeah.
these, these are kind of the ideological issues that are being discussed
Yep.
now in
Hmm.
economics and in society,
Hmm.
and you have and they're trying to be resolved just by through sort of political dominance rather than say, hey, there's a
Mm.
principled way of doing this.
Hmm.
This works
Hmm.
fine here, but it doesn't work fine there. And we
Right.
read the book of nature, and it tells us that we can. So that's where
Yeah.
I go. Okay,
So, like, when I teach this stuff, I teach my undergraduates that there's a golden rule of cooperation, and that this is like it must be met in order for cooperation to evolve and persist in a population. And there's many routes to meet the golden rule. And the golden rule is that genetic information that encodes for cooperative behavior has to have the benefits of that cooperative behavior come back at least 51% back onto to the members onto those replicators that encode information for cooperation. The benefits of cooperation have to resolve back to cooperators preferentially.
I mean, so this is a really big point because I don't know if there. So there was a work by a physicist, I think Bogosian was his name, when he did simulation of markets and free markets, and the assumption was that if you had a free market, that the benefits would always be equally distributed, and it would trickle down. What they found was it trickled up. It wasn't. It was both. In other words, cooperation and fairness was supposed to come out of equal exchange, but it didn't. It did. That 51% rule was not met. So, from a point of view of policy, if I'm running policies that I want to preserve a political body, a polis, then this 51% rule is absolutely essential into any kind of policy I would write if I'm interpreting.
Yeah. So I mean, altruism is evolutionarily is altruism is a behavior of an individual, right? I'm giving up something. I'm paying a cost to help another individual, and that if that if that same behavior, if a gene is altruistic, if you go back to your sort of Dawkinsian selfish gene, it's just going to weed itself out of a population, right? But individuals can be altruistic as long as the genes that encode for cooperation are not, if that makes sense, right? So here's a classic one, right? If you have a population of relatives, I could give up something to help a relative that might share the same genes for altruism in common with me because we got it from the same parents, right? I could help a relative even at individual cost, and I can gain reproductive equivalence through them. If my brother has kids, they're worth half as much in a genetic sense as if I have my own kids. And so if there's a big benefit, if I'm already done having kids, but I can give some resources to helping my brother have lots of kids, right? If there's sort of a scaling benefit, I get, it's altruistic at the level of, or even give up my life to help him reproduce a lot, right? It's altruistic at the level of the individual, but not at the level of the genes. So that's called the kin selection argument. And I have others, two others that I'd like to give you really quick. So that works for populations that are structured of relatives because you have that relatedness in common, where if a relative is reproducing, that's actually in many ways equivalent to me reproducing, just diluted by what proportion of our genomes we share in common. So an identical twin reproducing from a genetics perspective, just as good as me reproducing. Now, many populations, and the ones that you're probably most concerned about, don't contain relatives, right? We are talking about unstructured interactions amongst non-relatives, and these are very common in nature too. I talked when we last met. I gave a little lightning talk on how alignment in evolutionary biology is a solved problem with a 2 billion year track record, and the example that I used was the sort of cooperation between that's fundamental to eukaryotic cells. the symbiosis between what became the mitochondria and the larger cell, right? So just for listeners, eukaryotic cells are cells that have a complex kind of architecture. They are what we are made of, what plants are made of, what seaweeds are made of. They're like a very important kind of cell. And they have a 2 billion-year-old origin story, which was the symbiosis between an archaean, which is a kind of bacteria-like organism, and free-living bacteria that had a symbiotic interaction, and the bacteria gradually moved into this proto-eukaryotic cell and became sort of domesticated, in a sense, for producing energy. So the ATP, the powerhouses of the cell, this is done by mitochondria, which still have their own genome. They used to be free-living bacteria. They probably had about a 3 million base pair genome, so a big standard bacterial-sized genome. Now, in humans, it's like 25,000 base pairs. Most of their genes are stuck, actually absorbed into the nuclear genome, and they are now like this very interdependent part of a eukaryotic cell. So here's something where relatedness between these two partners isn't an axis. They don't share, the last common ancestor between the archaeal partner and the bacterial partner is probably 1 billion years before the symbiosis, maybe 2. Like, this is a very deep split. And so they don't have relatedness as a mechanism that can drive cooperation, but what they have instead is effectively, in this case, you can think of it as group selection. You have something where you have these co-integrated bacteria archaea partners, and they have shared interest. Like, the only way for the bacteria inside these archaea to reproduce is when the host makes more babies. So there's really no incentive to doing something selfish, because that hurts themselves in the long run. And what's more, natural selection is acting on the traits of the unit as a whole. Natural selection is acting on the reproduction of this new symbiotic entity, which is why I think actually a group selection framework works really well here. Because this is just a short tangent, one of the main weaknesses of the classic group selection arguments from Nowak, going all the way back to Wynne Edwards and George Williams in the 1960s, was talking about selection acting at a level above that of the primary Darwinian unit, the primary individual. And that's kind of weak, because it's a slow process. It might be sort of diffuse. It's a kind of a weak type of selection, right? You might have a lot of like individual level generations between group generations. If individuals are moving between groups, any selection on groups is now diffuse, right? Like, it's not that powerful. But when you're talking about the evolution of new levels of individuality, we don't have any of those weaknesses, really, because what we're talking about is the group becomes the primary unit, right? So the eukaryotic cell is the thing which is reproducing, which has heritable variation, which is gaining adaptations. The multicellular organism, like, we have a group selection origin story, which is we are groups that reproduce as groups, that have traits as groups, which natural selection acts on those traits. Yes, please, yeah.
So that's a really great point. So but the sense of the I don't know how putting it, I'm mapping it into different languages. I think
it's awesome.
It's like going from Michael was talking about going from neuroscience and cellular body. The mapping here. I think in terms of like organizations, and so what you're saying is that there's a sovereignty of the self is a solitary unit, though then that sovereignty, identity of self, gets expanded into a different definition of self sovereignty and self-interest as you create more units, you differentiate. So I mean, and I don't mean to take this too distant.
No, this is great. Yeah.
But to me, and this has been the weakness of so much in the classical economics, is that it's like a fixed pie. You can't say so. If you create a new thing, it's inflationary. But in fact, what you're doing is it's part of a new unit, a new definition of self.
Exactly.
Which creates new value. That creates new value. And so that is not inflation. That you're actually reducing uncertainty. You're reducing. This is what about free energy minimization. You're actually encompassing greater complexity. So we're actually developing a sort of an agentic economics based upon that principle. And so you start to resolve the issue in economics between sort of fiscal policy and monetary policy, because they're dynamically related to each other. What you issue is based upon your metabolism in some factors.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So, but
And here's one of the ways that in biology this gets really weird, and I think is kind of an underappreciated problem, which is in multicellular organisms like us, evolutionary information primarily arises through changes in your genome, right? You have mutations which change DNA bases, that changes that changes the organism, right? We all know we can do selective breeding, and we can get new kinds of dogs and pigeons and wheat, right? We see this playing out in every population of natural organisms. But it's the causality here is very strange. If you think about this, mutations are arising, spontaneously. Most of them are bad. A few of them are good, right? And that isn't actually changing the properties of organisms directly. No, it's not even changing the properties of cells directly. It is changing some piece of a cell. Every cell has a copy of the genome. Every cell has a copy of this mutation in organisms like us. But that mutation might change the composition of a protein or the regulation of some genetic circuit, right? It's changing some piece of a cell. And then that changes actually cell level properties as an emergent outcome. Like that you change a protein, you get a change in cell behavior. That part is actually unguided by strict developmental scaffolding. That's like an emergent thing. And then the change to the organism, and that next sort of percolation up to the changes of tissues and the changes of organisms are additional levels of emergence, where if I'm changing the rate of firing of some bioelectric component of a cell, I can change the rate at which cells communicate in tissues. I can change the rate at which I run away from that predator that just jumped out of a bush, right? So clearly selection is acting on the properties as they've manifested through multiple levels of emergence. But the information arises at the very lowest level. The novelty arises at the lowest level, but the selection is acting primarily at the highest level. And so you end up getting basically organisms that are very good translators of heritable change at very low mechanistic components into beneficial traits at very high levels where natural selection is actually adding sort of information value into organisms. Complexity comes from selection, right?
Let me. This is a curveball, actually.
Yes.
So translate that into a social organization. Translate that into how you
the behaviors
an organization or even society. You say,
okay, yeah.
So how
That's
do
right.
you get the percolation that comes up?
Yes.
You have the selection
Yes.
that comes right.
It works the same way.
Okay.
How much did I pay for this shirt?
Yeah.
$10. I bought it at Lidl. If you know Lidl, right? It's $10 shirt, right? How many people do you think touched this shirt? A few hundred, right? Like how many inventions went into making this shirt super economical? And yet none of this was orchestrated through top-down integration. This is actually completely the fascinating global supply chain that allows, cotton to be grown in America. It's shipped to Bangladesh for spinning wool. It is sewn in Vietnam. It is shipped back to the United States. It's shipped out to Lidl. I drive my car there, which is made all around the world. I buy it for 1/6 of an hour's worth of my time or something super cheap, right? Like that's done emergently. There is no coordination at the higher level for all those things to work. But what happens is selection acting on firms for lower prices essentially percolates the information to the system that makes it extraordinarily efficient. And it's the same thing with organisms. How is that for translating it? I'm pretty happy with that one.
That was one of the things we're looking at. We have this concept of a biofirm, but the idea is that the selection. We're interested in creating having the selection to create for innovation that reduces the cost and achieves the likelihood of the outcome. So it's following a free energy or least action principle. And so the end result is not prescribing how it's done, but it's really it's like how do you optimize around having something be accessible? This is like a public goods concept, accessible and inexpensive and as effective as possible. And so rather than have it necessarily be captured by a particular entity that captures all the value. Now, is there a precedent for that in biology, or is that a
Absolutely. So we're going to shift gears just a little bit.
All
right.
Well, I mean, you're not going to get a lot of economists with you. Go. I'm with you here. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No. I think this one will make sense. So we've so far been talking about the evolution of organisms, new kinds of organisms, which are composed of parts, where the parts used to be their own organisms, right? And that's a kind of alignment. That's a kind of stability that I think, we can learn some cool lessons from. But there's two kind of ways that if I think about what alignment or what cooperation or what stability means, my mind goes to. And this is the first one. Cooperation, transitions, individuality, how you basically keep the benefits, the resources from fitness going to genes that encode for cooperative behaviors rather than selfish behaviors. We've kind of talked about that. The other kind of stability that's out there is quite different, and that's ecological stability, right? Like, how do you have ecosystems that contain thousands of species? How are they stable over million-year timescales or longer? And are they resilient to perturbation? Actually, many of them are, right? You can really deeply perturb them and they bounce back pretty quickly to their prior state. So what makes ecosystems stable and resilient? And the answer here is completely different from the answer in evolution about the alignment of parts in a new organism. And ecological stability and resilience largely comes from two things. The first is specialization, such that different species are the most fit in their particular small slice of a pie, right? Heterogeneity. This could be spatial heterogeneity or temporal heterogeneity, right? So that there isn't just one winner that comes in and wins everything, but that heterogeneity allows for different things to win at different times, right? And then the third sort of part of this, and the ecological literature, this is like me distilling a huge amount of ecological literature into just three principles, but specialization, heterogeneity, and negative frequency dependent dynamics or negative feedback loops, that the more common something gets, the worse it gets. And this is very intuitive in the sense that imagine it as a very simple predator-prey dynamic between a lynx and hares. There's a classic ecological literature going back to those examples, which is why I use them. It goes back to Locke Volterra. But if you have a bunch of rabbits, all of a sudden the predators on these rabbits are getting tons of food and they're having tons of kids, so you can get some really nice introduction to your coupled ordinary differential equations with this kind of theory. But your rabbits explode, the predators follow that, but now they are over consuming that rabbit prey, and the rabbits, their population falls down, but now the predators start to starve, so they fall off. Now the rabbits are reproducing faster than can be eaten, they bounce back, and you get these cyclical dynamics. You see the same thing with pathogens, right? With host pathogen type evolution. And this is very, very, very common, that if something gets too common, it often starts to suffer. Maybe it's just there's more of it around, and therefore things that eat it or things that infect it are extra, happy. And so negative frequency dependent selection, if you get common, your fitness is low. If you're rare, hey, nobody's trying to eat you. There are no things that have diseases that can infect you. If you're a one of a kind, that's a good position to be in for lots of organisms.
So you become a target in some sense. So you create a niche that focuses on that because that's an available resource.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
So if I put this in the context of some of the things that we're looking at, are you familiar with the notion of the law of requisite variety? Is that a term?
I am not. No, this is the first time I've heard of it.
Okay, well there you go. It's also there's something called the good regulator theorem that's coming out. It was done by Ashby and Conant. But if you're in the world of cybernetics, and actually this is something Carl Fritson uses a lot, the law of requisite variety seems to be, and is what you were partly describing. In a sense that in order for a system to maintain its independence, it has to and this gets into the whole notion of what we look at Markov blankets, and I'm familiar with the whole concept of Markov blankets and boundaries it can do. But it's how to maintain its independence. It has to generate a requisite amount of variety of the environment it's interacting with, which means it's not just it's the cardinality of things. In other words, a good model of something is the best way of adapting to something, and this is also in Feynman's terms. And so you have a way of regulating that. You say, okay, now, because if you don't, then the other system will dominate you, and then it'll be subsumed into that system. And
Gotcha.
And Ashby, who came up with this, he developed what he called these homeostats, where they're hyper stable because they could take but they sort of worked on these principles. But it strikes me is what you're talking about in some of the ecological points is that so you have an organism existing in an ecology. So if we're talking about people and building things, you want to be able to maintain the variety of the organism with respect to the variety of the environment and have. I mean, it favors heterogeneity. Polystable
Yes.
favors things that have random events. So you want to have certain randomization. You want to randomize certain things. You don't want to be locked into certain states. So you have the
Yes.
ability to jump states in different kinds of, rather than have a lock-in. And so that's seen to be a sort of ultra stable systems, they call it. Anyway,
That's super
um,
cool. Yeah, there are relatively few winner take all markets in biology for the reasons that I just mentioned. These are extremely sensitive dynamical systems that tend to punish winners, actually. Like you can have winners, but then as soon as you're the winner, you are subject to all sorts of problems.
so you're going in
Yeah.
the same territory that I'm going into, is it? So
Okay, cool.
one of our discussants was David Silverswig, who's
Yeah.
former dean of the Harvard Medical School, and
Hmm.
he's a neuroscientist. And we're having this discussion of certain when pathology when ideologies become pathologies, is that they have a
Hmm.
certain characteristic to them. If you and so can you say a winners
Hmm.
take all mentality under a
Hmm.
certain context is really sort of pathological to the survival of that group that it represents. I mean, you is there a
Hmm.
scientifically normative way in which you design things to achieve certain kind of outcomes, and these are now social outcomes, and that's where I think we're going.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And that we're designing agents that embody
Yeah.
those things.
Yes.
And so, do you think that what you're saying,
Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
you're providing a set of principles,
Yes.
with principles to design these things
Yes.
that are stable and complex
Yeah.
and
So,
replicate.
okay. Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two ways that you could think about how, and I haven't thought about this as much as I would like, but like there's two ways you could think about applying these ideas to what you're talking about. One would be that the creation of something new, like a new level of individuality, right, still requires the former individuals to be there and to be playing a role. And like, we still are made of cells. We haven't gotten rid of cells, even though we have new multicellular organisms. And that can be really stable because those cells are doing individual behaviors that they have to all work together to do the thing at the group level. And that thing at the group level often opens up completely new terrain. That's the real magic here. If that didn't happen, it probably wouldn't happen. There has to be some sort of like non-linear payoff. And the way I think about this is that multicellular organisms can do things that depend upon the behavior of their cells, but they are non-commensurable with those traits. So if I change the behavior of a cell, it gives me a new group behavior that's not an additive function, not even a nonlinear function. There is no mathematical functional mapping of those two things because it's a completely orthogonal trait. But hey, in the case of animals, that's vision, cognition, motility, like the things that actually are why animals were such a successful clade of multicellular organisms. But they of course have like cell level causation. And so and that's very, very stable, right? So in your case, if you could have a collective of agents where the collective behaviors depend on the behaviors of the components, and the fitness of the collective then filters back down to the components so that they all share in the spoils of what the group gets,
This
right?
is what we designed, actually.
Awesome. Awesome.
So what is it bioform? Let's just run it by you, because
Yeah.
so the principle, there's certain core algorithms we use. One is the free energy principle, the minimization of uncertainty. So if
Hmm.
you can, and the other is being able to maintain homeostasis
Hmm.
within that context. So
Hmm.
if you're
Hmm.
and so you design something that's trying to achieve some kind of outcome, and that outcome, and anything that, and you have a group of people, agents and other people contributing to that, and
Hmm.
they can contribute different kinds of things. They can contribute data, they can create models, they can try to take certain actions.
Hmm.
But the question is the extent to which they create something new, they actually
Hmm.
significantly reduce that
Hmm.
uncertainty. Then they get rewarded within the network, and so you
Oh,
have
very
something
cool.
called Shapley value. The Shapley
Yep.
value, you're familiar with that. So the Shapley value allocates that and then resets
Hmm.
the clock. And so it's not inflationary. It's not you're creating an economic system that's non-inflationary, and it
Right.
also is
Right.
subject to the maintaining the metabolic rate, the homeostasis of the system.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
and
That's
so
cool.
and
I like that.
it's like a token. And so we'll actually say, well, you
Yeah.
issue tokens based. This is an economy based upon non-extraction, but actually
Hmm.
combination.
Yes.
And so,
Yes.
okay.
Yes. That's cool. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. That's awesome.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
what I can't tell you how happy that makes me. But anyway,
And
yeah,
one of the interesting things that we've seen in biology, right, is that often these breakthroughs in what your sort of collective can do, it has really interesting ecological. So we were talking about evolutionary changes, making organisms more complex, but it has massive implications for ecology, right? So in the case of multicellularity, like we name many of our ecosystems based on like the dominant multicellular organism that lives there. Forests, grasslands, tundra, coral reefs, like, and it's, once you have a coral reef, that creates the habitat for all of the recyclers and the predators of the reef and the predators of those predators and the parasites of those parasites and the combinatoric explosion of specialization. This is connecting these two things, right?
no, no, no,
The
no.
Yeah,
I got you. You got you.
yes, that actually is like that's what makes life on Earth so rich, right? Once you have land plants around 450 million years ago slowly make their way out of the ocean and start colonizing land, like land got a lot more interesting. There was plenty of bacteria on land before land plants, but once land plants come along, it is complete game changer, right? And I suspect that it's the same for economics. Once you have the Industrial Revolution, you basically create all these new niches for different kinds of jobs that weren't there before. And this isn't inflationary. You've just made the pie 1,000 times bigger, right?
That's the whole point. Absolutely. So it's not a zero-sum game. I mean, the other thing that I'm seeing in working with it is the AI stuff. Is that we're working also with large language models and other and sort of actually how to pull information at them and then render them into local contextual models that have own causal model graphs and things like that. But what then you can do is simulate. I mean, this is a different. You can rather than incur the cost of something, you can create a model of different. You can go through a million generations, and know, and test out for something to see what makes sense and not incur the physical risk. And I think this is something that is altogether new in evolution. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's. I don't know if you're familiar with James Lovelock work on the Gaia principle. Yeah, I'm sure you heard.
I've heard of it, but
Okay,
generally
the
sort of
Gaia
dismissed
principle.
within
Well,
yeah.
it's got, he was a geoscientist,
Hmm.
but he said the Earth is a living thing.
Hmm.
But he had also talked about a transition from a world in which it's where the Anthropocene into a
Hmm.
Novocene, where
Hmm.
you're this a whole new kind of species is coming out. I mean
Hmm.
that is not subject to the physics of biological time. In other words, rather
Mm.
than the cycles, you can explore a whole
Yeah.
space and nothing.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing
Yeah.
is
That's I
is
see. I
just
see that.
phenomenal how you can generate stuff now. I
Mm.
mean,
Mm.
talk about proposals. We
Yeah.
could generate 1,000 proposals for different
Mm.
organizations, different
Mm.
funding groups, and different review group in just an hour. And they're actually pretty
So
good. I mean, so
so
this is something
yeah.
that wasn't there before. And I just
Yeah.
wonder about your
Well, can
thoughts.
I? Yeah, no, totally. That's a great point. And I want to circle back to the breaking fundamental physical temporal constraints because that is a huge issue in evolution. But actually, something you said just made me think of this. Like, if I think like what makes humans special, and I think humans are very special organisms. What makes humans special is the capacity for cultural evolution, right? That ideas can spread from brain to brain, and good ideas are more fit than, well, actually, that's not always true. Good ideas and bad ideas can both be very fit, as I think we're seeing in right now. Bad ideas are spreading really quickly, right? But what makes humans like so different from any other organism is that we accumulate the best ideas over billions of lifetimes, right? And those are sort of themselves these somewhat independent entities that are propagating within the brain space of humans, right? And what unlocked that for us is basically the combination of having memories and cognition, but also a combinatoric language where any arbitrarily large amounts of information can be encoded in a series of symbols, and we can pass on any information that we want to others, and we're not restricted to like trying to make a bespoke signal for every single different meaning that we have, right? And so that is a sort of a manifold of complexity that has been profoundly important for life on Earth. And as far as we know, that's only happened one time in humans. And when it really took off, which is just the last couple thousand years, just maybe tens of thousands, but really you can really see it going exponential in the last couple thousand years, especially once we can start communicating more broadly than just the people we could talk to in our local group. So once writing as a inexpensive writing, printing presses and whatnot get going, it's like you really see this like exponential capacity just go through the roof. It seems like something similar you may be on the cusp of that with generative modeling, right?
So part of my background is computational linguistics, so I was really
fantastic.
so my thesis was actually modeling discourse and how people with a multi-agent model of discourse. And
amazing.
But and the more work that's been done now, and actually I have to give Carl Friston a lot of work credit on it, is that you're looking at. Here me take an example of a difference between a pidgin and a Creole and a general language. So you have two populations that have never seen each other, human beings, but eventually they through diaxis, this is not that, they can construct a pidgin language that allows them to take certain transactions. Then they incorporate social conventions into that, and then they have a full language, and suddenly they're able to make mutual representations, construct the whole semantics between.
Oh, that's cool.
Well, now you can do that with agents. So now you have artificial agents being able to create their own synthetic language, and with expression, the full expression of a. So what is unique to human beings is the sort of infinite expressiveness of language. But now you can do that with agents, and then they accelerate that at a level. I mean, and they can explore all sorts of combinations, and you can have fitness functions selecting back from that. But it just puts it in a whole nother space. And I think that what we're seeing, and it's sort of, you say, oh my God, you think, oh, well, we're human being will be in the loop here. Well, and it's like, well, no, actually, it's so much faster. Yes, it makes mistakes, but we all make mistakes. I mean, I think it's a whole new threshold. And I was just wondering your thoughts on that, because is there a new kind of emergent species coming out of this that's not subject to the physical, biological, temporal constraints that we typically have?
Wow. I don't know. I mean, I'm not even sure how to map what biologists think of species concepts onto computer programs. It's pretty different. But if you think about it purely in terms of evolving information in the way that, like, I don't know how you'd make species of cultural evolution either, right? Like biological species, even that we argue about, but I have a pretty good idea of what that is, even though, look, we argue about that a lot. That's not a solved problem.
Well, just to your point, I think that one of the things we can do now is you can create an agent, and I reference Marcus Buehler's work with a psi agent, so you can give it a task to achieve, and that can be a pretty broad task, and it can be sort of underspecified. It's just like and it learns to specify it. But then it'll learn very fast in conjunction with others. So it's creating structures, it's creating knowledge, it's creating, and so I would argue it's creating a culture, it's creating representations of things that it shares with others, and then it's trying to use that representation to act upon the world in order to get some resource or do some other kind of thing. Biology
is only Darwinian chemistry, right? So we have chemical polymers that are capable of doing the things you just said. Evolution is an emergent property of that, right? But then it gets made better and better by biological mechanism. But it's just an emergent property of chemistry. And, evolution is an algorithm. If something has the capacity to replicate, encode heritable variation in traits which affect their own frequency as a part of that replicating population, they will evolve. They will get more fit over time, right? Like, assuming there aren't things that completely break that from happening. And that's why it happens in information space. That's why ideas and languages themselves evolve. That's why you could set it up in a computer, and it's such that if you have replicators in a computer in which variation arises, in which you have a selective function acting on that, which affects their frequency, they will evolve too. And most of the examples of this in computers have been like evolutionary by intention. Like, we've created an evolutionary algorithm. You could even think of gradient descent as a form of an evolutionary algorithm, just where we're calculating the gradients rather than letting randomness sample the gradients, right? But actually, as you're saying, it's super interesting to think how coupling real world resources to the behavior of agents and creating mechanisms for those agents to modify their traits in a way that's heritable could actually result in the open-ended evolution of AI type agents. Like, there's no reason that couldn't work.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's sort of the conclusion I'm coming to. And I guess what I'm thinking is, well, the other thing is, I think in a very pragmatic way, you can see where there's a certain level of cognitive automation that can take place, and that things that have required certain special skills. I mean, one of the things I'm looking at legal, we're doing this project with Stanford and the Kodak Center, and actually legal reasoning, and trying to create legal reasoning as a public good. um, and because if you have certain rights, and how do you protect or enforce those rights? The cost of doing that is extremely high, and that's gamed all over the place. But if you can automate that process and collapse that process, then you have the better likelihood of achieving those outcomes. And that's a kind of agent that one can create.
And where the rules are very clear, which is nice.
But it actually, I mean, there's always ambiguity and inconsistency. You have different worldviews about different judges and different jurisdictions, interpretations. So it's not and you don't need to. It's just a probability of a prediction of some kind of outcome that makes sense for that particular entity, and so. And the emphasis here is not just on the logic, but is what controls the logic is this thing trying to keep itself stable. In other words, and this gets into biological metaphors, is saying, well, what it tends to, and what it tries to do is preserve its definition of itself within a certain set of resource constraints in a particular niche. And so that's actually, so when you have legal reasoning and you have that representing different interest groups as they're reasoning around their ability to exist within a particular niche, and so the ability to expand or accept new information is really contingent upon that rather than any kind of inherent logic. And this gets into I was want to ask you about Robert Trivers' stuff. So he talks about self-deception. So the idea is it's that there's certain things you do not want to see in order to preserve certain kinds of states that allow you to exist in a particular niche. So you'll block out information, and that is a particular that is a survival strategy within the certain niches. You say, I know this is not true, but in this social context, I have more interest in being connected to these people than believing in Newton.
There's a kind of interesting biological analogy there that's outside of behavior. Well, I mean, I guess it is behavior, but there's a concept called reinforcement speciation, where if you have like two species that are capable of exchanging, genes, so they're like incipient species, but hybrids have low fitness because like they have, they're neither of their parents. They're some crappy intermediary. You will have, organisms then evolve mate choice or some other mechanism that basically causes them to no longer reproduce with the other species, preferring a song or preferring a certain plumage or something, or timing of reproduction, or even a location of reproduction that like separates those populations genetically so that they don't end up kind of like, investing a bunch of resources and making offspring that will be less fit. So you can kind of have this feedback loop drive larger divergences from something which is maybe just a small little, enough differentiation that hybrids don't do so well, and then you can drive really robust differentiation.
Well, and so in your experience, to what extent do you see these ideas influencing economics or other other models, prescriptive models of social organization? Or is this starting to happen, or is this?
I mean, I'd say you should tell me because I'm not an economist.
Well, I mean, what we started the conversation when we went back to this event where we were talking about alignment, and
Yes.
like
Yep.
for fun, and you say,
Yep.
well, biology, well, alignment is a huge issue right now, right?
Yes.
And you
Yes.
have polarization, you have a lot of
Yeah.
mechanisms in
Yeah.
place that are
Yeah.
being rewarded,
Yeah.
and so this idea, I mean, one of the things I took from some of your readings
Mm.
is that it's a repeat. If you have a repeat game and you have a
Mm-hmm.
repetition, and
Mm-hmm.
each know themselves, then it's unlikely that you have as much cheating or
Mm-hmm.
defection. But if
Mm-hmm.
you design systems that are transactional, and you do
Mm.
not know, and you can often look at
Mm-hmm.
social media as sort of a pathological niche.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
can you say that? I mean, can you really say that and say from that they're in a principled way, because you could be anonymous, it's transactional, and you're
Yeah.
rewarded for defection, or you're
Those are those are conditions that definitely favor defection. Yeah, repeat games. To be clear, repeat games tend to favor cooperation because if you can figure out who's a cooperator and then interact with them more, then you get the benefits of cooperation and you can essentially exclude cheats as a cost, right? So one-off games, anonymous, yeah, those are pretty rough for this classic theory.
exactly. So again, I come
Yeah,
back to policy, informing
yeah,
policy, and
yeah.
having principled basis for policy for social
Yeah.
organization. That biology teaches us a
Hmm.
lot of what is good, what can be good policy.
Yes. Yep.
Um,
Yep. And
so
I think it's also like useful to think about the fact that a lot of biological mechanisms have shown that stability can be effectively permanent. Like you can have alignment and stability that is, I mean, billion year time frame
that's
permanent, which for
pretty good.
human
That's
time
a good
frames, like that's permanent, right?
They just put this in the context of when people look at democracies as being, they only last so long, and they say, oh, and inevitably they collapse, and then you have a takeover. And you're saying, well, maybe it doesn't. If you adhere to certain kind of principles, you can have stable complexity and scalable complexity without necessarily having collapse. Well, then that's a very important
Well, maybe I wouldn't go that
very
far in the sense
important
that
idea. Pardon?
one of the important parts of these ecological and evolutionary systems is that they are dynamical and collapses are occurring constantly, but collapses don't persist in the face and cooperative. You know, you have mitochondria in your body in every not every cell, but almost every cell, which they take their ancestor back 2 billion years to a free living bacteria, right? And there have been plenty of mitochondrial collapses in those last 2 billion years on the lineage, but not on the lineage which you persist from, right? They are little dead ends that didn't make it to now, right? And so like there is a sort of like collapses happen all the time, and collapses could be a dynamical consistency in a world of 250 potential democracies, but you still have maybe democracy being a stable state in which there are still democracies in some countries, and maybe some of them last a really long time.
But what I'm getting back to is not the what is the design? What's the protocol for a stable state of a democracy? That the things that you need to adhere to maintain that lineage over time. Yes, it can adhere to it can have multiple collapses. It can have it, but there's something that to persist and be able to grow. And so because and this is the idea of how do you maintain the stability at scale is what you're talking. I think you're alluding to, and so rather than having it be trial and error and hit or miss, there's actually you have is that no. Well, you have certain laws. If you enforce the laws and you don't allow certain to happen, then you mean, and so it's really building a system that actually is able to self-enforce enforce these certain principles and not have them be captured. I guess it'd be another way of putting it.
No, that's hard. I mean, that seems like that's a I'm not enough of like a political theorist to give you like I'm sure other people have thought about this much more, deeply than I myself have. I mean, one thing that I was just thinking of as you said that was that if I think of countries as organisms, organisms have a lifespan. The end of many animals is cancer, and which you can actually see as a sort of deterioration of alignment. And that's caused by the fact that we started out as one cell, a fertilized egg, a zygote, which develops into an organism, but every cell shares the same genotype, right? That's just copied from that first cell over and over and over. But every time you make a copy, there's a chance of making mistakes. You get too much sun, you can cause mutations. The accumulation of those mutations creates enough genetic variation that now you have like within group competition, the potential for within group evolution. If you have a lineage of cells that's growing faster than it should, or it doesn't, or ignores stop signals to continue growing when it should stop, you get a tumor, right? If you have, mutations within the tumor that make them speed up, those outcompete the slower ones. So you get this kind of runaway, like that this is actually like kind of, I was alluding to this earlier, like many of the problems we have as organisms stem from the fact that our cells are like somewhat suppressed in their evolvability. And if you kind of reignite that, in this case, through creating new genetic variation within an organism, that can actually result in the Darwinian algorithm running amok. Because once it's present, it will drive evolution. If you have mutations which result in faster growth, they will be they could be selected for within that tumor, giving you faster tumor growth, tumor metastasis, eventually the death of the organism.
You have a criteria of cancer that you're killing the host. I mean,
well, no, I think the criterion would just be like proliferation when normally that lineage would not proliferate. So you could have like a benign cancer that is very slow growing or isn't one that is known to metastasize. Because honestly, the main problem with most cancer is metastasis. Pretty much every multicellular lineage has something like cancer where cells grow when they shouldn't, plants and fungi and seaweeds. But it's really only in animals that it's like a dire threat to the life of the organism. Because, if a plant gets a tumor on a branch, it can drop a branch. And that cancer can't spread because the plant, all those cells are fixed in place. And they're modular, so if they lose a branch, usually they're okay. And the same for fungi and the same for seaweeds. So it's really animals that are actually kind of uniquely susceptible to cancer because we're big, trillions of cells, we're long-lived, many generations with which mutation can arise and which selection can play out within an organism. Metastasis can happen no problem because we're just one giant bag of meat. And then we can't afford to lose a third of our body. That would kill us when it might not kill a plant or it might not kill a fungus.
But I guess one of the things, and we're rounding up a little bit here, but is that that when you talk about a nation, I think the concept of a nation state is that is a social construct, came out of Westphalia. It was developing the parameters of what the boundary conditions are, and you had social organization that come out of that. Now we're moving into something different that's much more dynamic. And so, what defines the unit of what the self is that it's self-organizing and preserving? Maybe that should be a dynamic boundary itself, and that. And so, if we have any insight in terms of the next generation institutional design, that would be.
I got a thought for you.
Okay, I thought so.
So I grew up in Berkeley, California, and raised by hippie parents, and honestly raised to be like fairly skeptical of standard patriotic, slogans and feelings, because it's sort of like, they came through the Vietnam War and they were kind of soured on, right? Yeah, understandable. But in many ways, I actually think that a strong sense of patriotism is really good for a country, in the sense that if you feel identity with the higher level whole, you're much more willing to do things that are in the best interests of the collective, even at potential personal risk, right? So someone who's really patriotic might be a whistleblower and lose their job. They might risk going into war
That's the problem right now. That's the problem
Yeah.
right now. And I would quarrel a little bit with maybe patriotism, because I think that's alignment to the primacy of a state and
Yes.
and a nation. Was I think there's certain if you have alignment with certain principle, and it's an evolving.
That's
If
right.
it's an evolving
That's
notion, it's like,
Yes.
okay, it's not. I mean, is it my country right or wrong? No, I don't think so. I've
Good
grown
point.
up where I was very active in civil
Right.
rights, man of war. I went
Right.
through all that. I was in Selma.
Yep.
So
Oh, that's amazing.
yeah,
That's
I was
cool.
there turnaround Tuesday. I was right
Wow.
there. Yeah,
I drive past Martin Luther King's church like all the time. It's on my commute to work.
is that right? Oh, okay.
Yep.
And so,
Yep.
that's been part of my
Yeah.
history, and
That's cool.
I worked with the Black Panthers. So there you go.
That's awesome. That's super cool. Yeah.
But it is
Yeah.
a sense of there are standards above your own
Yeah.
self-interest, and there's something
Yes.
that you're involved in. And I think now there's a generation of people who say, well, yeah, it's not it's actually keeping the planet alive, keeping things alive.
Yeah.
And
That's right.
it's
That's right.
like aliveness is really,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
and I have a broader responsibility in that context.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
that's and so
I think that's well said.
yeah, yeah.
I completely agree with you. I was kind of trying to formulate my thoughts on patriotism as I said it, but you actually picked up exactly what I meant, which is like you feel identity, strong identity, willingness to sacrifice something meaningful to your own short-term interests, right? Your own individual short-term interests to perpetuate a value or a virtue that you hold as being really
Well,
important.
I mean,
And yeah.
so I come from a Puritan strain here. They've been here a
Mm,
long time, and
mm,
it's really. I mean, there are people. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War. I mean, the people
mm,
gave up their fortune. I mean, they didn't
mm,
have to. They could have run
mm.
somewhere else,
Right.
and that was
Right.
really critical to
Yeah.
this country. And it was like,
Yeah.
yeah, it wasn't all about me. You say, no,
Mm,
this is really important, and I think we're
yep.
missing that. I think that's what you're
Yep.
alluding to.
Yep.
Um, but
And I
yeah.
have a slightly like maybe positive spin on the whole cancer angle that I was mentioning
Okay,
before.
go. Positive
uh,
answer.
well, if you think about like just okay, there's what 8 billion humans. Maybe 25% of people will have some serious cancer at some point in their lifetime, right? Like this is a really common dynamic. That's I don't know how many like quadrillion cancer cells existing, per year or something, right? We're talking a huge amount of just cancer biomass, right? And yet, what's the fate of those cancerous lineages? They don't persist. They don't persist beyond the lifespan of the organism in which they're living in, and then that organism dies and they go away. So you actually have this between individual selection extraordinarily powerfully constraining within group conflict and within group deterioration, right? So even if you had countries that don't last forever, we're not talking 1,000-year countries, 200-year countries that have democracy but fall apart due to societal cancer, you may still have a population of countries that are resilient and actually have healthy cultures, healthy
Well,
institutions.
if I understand what you're building on that, so you may have
Yes.
that residual that may learn from and
Mm.
develop a robustness from the experience of the other. It would be. Would you think it could be more robust? And it's that next generation. I mean,
Or if the cancer is self-limiting. So to put this in like societal terms, if a country falls apart internally due to selfish interests, essentially taking priority over those of the commons, resulting in a failure of governance and a failure of the state, then that economic that the social the country and the systems that are in the country at that time of failure may be thrown away, which is the death of the country level organism, and it may be replaced by institutions from another similar country or something, right? Which would be like a rebirth, a new start of the life cycle, where you now have new institutions in place. You've learned from the mistakes of the past. You've set up structures that, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the origin of America and what the founding
oh
fathers
yeah,
took from
no,
their
and I think
prior
we're going
political
through that now.
experiences.
Yeah, I think we're
Yeah,
going through that again. Frankly, I mean, I think that's
it feels
we're
that way to
we're
me
at a
too.
transition point. Yeah, and so
Yes,
where is that point to transition to? Learning what we've
right,
done,
right.
can we
Yep,
when we learn, but we have a principled way of doing that.
yep,
And so again, it's the book of life or the nature. It's
yeah,
like, okay, maybe this is some clues.
yeah.
Man, I really appreciate this conversation.
Awesome.
And I'd love. I mean, at some point when we talk offline, I'd love to do a paper or something around
That'd be
this.
fun. That'd be
Okay,
super fun. Yeah, no, I think that
I,
would be
yeah,
really stimulating, and we both it wouldn't
yeah.
even like it's stuff that we both know super well, so it wouldn't like be super hard. It would be fun, right?
Yeah, that'd be fun to do. I really like,
Yeah.
and I love your point of view. So I
Thank you.
really appreciate you doing this, and
Yeah.
it was
Yeah. Yeah.
really
Yeah.
fun. and extremely informative to me, I have to say.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I was telling everyone that like meeting you at that conference was like a highlight of the conference for me. Like it left me super energized and was like, oh, this is like why I came, right? To have these like,
Well,
I would have never had this conversation with you
it's,
otherwise. So